welcome to Freya's Free Practice Fridays. I'm back with the OG, James Baldwin. How are you going?
Good to be here. Good to finally stop the flow of nonsense from the other people who have appeared on this show and who clearly cannot hold together a podcast by themselves for a race preview. But anyway, I'm back. So you're welcome, listener. Things are going to get back on track because I am traveling. As you said before we started recording, I'm going from international traveller to domestic traveller for the next couple of weeks. And as much as the distance is similar for me to be flying between like London and Paris and probably down to Barcelona, it's not as exciting, but going from Melbourne, Sydney and then to Adelaide. But anyway, we push on.
It doesn't really have the same glow, does it? Like international man of travelling mystery becomes Australian domestic Canberra frequent. Like it's just not the same. It doesn't roll off the tongue. I don't know. Not the same level of mystery. But welcome back.
No, and frustratingly more flights. Yeah. But anyway, we do it because of things and reasons, I guess. But look, we're here to talk about the Singapore Grand Prix, which I'm very excited about because it's been a while. And as we were both sort of mentioning to ourselves before we started recording, all we've seen from everyone that we sort of follow or deal with or have dealt with in the past on Formula One social media, all Thursday seemed to be for them was getting absolutely hammered on Singapore slings at raffles. So good luck to all of you doing Friday press days and free practice with hangovers.
I think they'll be hoping that someone is slinging them some Panadol and other things come the weekend. But let's get stuck into the news of the week. Like you said, we are back at Singapore. We haven't been here since 2019. So there's a few people who haven't raced here at all and others just not for a while. Vettel was our last winner, which is just really strange to think about. But let's have a look at some news of the week before we talk about what we're excited about when it comes to the Singapore race. So first of all, Zhou Guanyu has been confirmed for next year. It does just seem to be a 1-year commitment at this point. I, for one, was not particularly surprised by that announcement, but pleased as well. I think he's had a tough but strong start to his Formula One career, and I think he's one of those people whose results don't necessarily translate on paper in terms of how good an effort he's really made in his first year. What were your reactions to that news, James?
Yeah, as you say, I don't think anyone should be surprised that Zhou Guanyu is re-signed, but he's only signed for another year. Look, I think for his rookie season, he's done more than enough, hasn't he, to keep himself in the seat for 2023. There's not really another option. Théo Pourchaire as an Alfa Sauber Junior would be the likely next choice. We've said sort of time and time again over the last couple of weeks that he wants to leave F2 and he's not going to race in F2 next year. I think with this announcement and the confirmation of sort of suspicions around the paddock and also what we've sort of been talking about, he would probably want to maybe revisit his thought process with that because although it looks like maybe Nick de Vries will be going to Williams after all, the entry from Formula E and IndyCar to Formula One is not really guaranteed, nor is it common. We've seen with Colton Herta as well. I know you guys have spoken about it over the last couple of weeks too in terms of super license points. Look, I think that should be reviewed anyway. I don't think the exception should be for Colton Herta for this point, but certainly next year and years beyond, the FIA need to look at other series to see what this super license points actually means. But Zhou Guanyu has done more than enough for many sort of situations really in the last couple of races too. He's been outperforming Valtteri. Sometimes that's been with an issue with Valtteri's car. Sometimes that's just been on pace. So I think they both get on very well. They seem like they're not really outspoken one way or another. They're pretty sort of middle ground two drivers. And I think noting what's probably going to be happening with backroom chats with Audi, looking at purchasing Sauber over the next couple of months to next year, they're the kind of driver lineup where nothing's going to really shake it. Any massive headlines out and Autosport's not going to be reporting, this random text or send whatever else. So I think it makes sense. They've got a good pairing for the rest of this year into next year. What I would say, though, is maybe both Valtteri and Zhou's results aren't based necessarily on their specific performance, but it seems that Alfa Romeo is sort of dropping towards the back as a race team at the moment. So hopefully for 2023, they can sort of get themselves back towards the mid-pack, which is where a lot of these Ferrari customer teams started 2022.
Well, that's it. We were so excited about their season at the beginning of things, thinking back to Bahrain and around those first couple of races. We were so excited about VB coming back with a fresh face and looking a lot happier. And we still see that from him, I think. And, you know, it's great to have, it's always great to have I don't want to say a second chance, but that continued kind of faith in a rookie, I suppose. I think, you know, it's so cutthroat, and you see people kind of going, oh, well, first year you didn't perform and out you go. It's good to see that he's been given some time to adjust to the car and get some performance under his belt. But he's also done pretty well for his first year. And like you said, I think for a team as they stand at the moment, they won't be looking to introduce drastic changes. They'll probably be looking to stabilise over the next little while, because there could be some bigger changes coming down the line. Sticking to driver market, also, go Tiffy, mate. We're very sorry. We're going to miss you dearly, but you'll not be racing for Williams next year. Thoughts, feelings, emotions, James?
Well, my first thoughts are I'm glad the boys completely missed this news early in the week with the Singapore preview episode. So 10-second penalty each for them for completely not reading anything to do with Formula One news. Look, the writing's been on the wall for him for some time. I think we were all surprised that he even got re-signed for 2022, to be perfectly honest. The guy seems to be incredibly super lovely. He's very well respected in the Williams team. But when your main competition, quite simply now for that seat, is the guy who beat you in Formula 2 to the championship, I think that says enough now. The weight of pay drivers, I think, for Williams is less than what it used to be. Certainly with Dalton Capital coming in now and really fixing up the financial situation of the team. And what that means is Williams will want to be investing in drivers who can actually push themselves forward. You know, you've got the pay driver situation we've seen, you know, in the past with Sergei Sorokin. We had, before that, we've sort of had Lance Stroll as well, haven't we? And Robert Kubica, who brought in that all-in that all-in gas money as well. So now that that's sort of behind them, hopefully they can get Nick de Vries. I really think that Nick should have a good crack in that seat for next year. I don't really see anyone else, even Logan Sargent. And this is one thing that maybe concerns me slightly. If Williams don't sign de Vries is obviously suddenly he's got stocks up as a result of Monza, and they wait to see what happens with Logan Sargent. He doesn't have a super license yet and isn't guaranteed points. They'll have to wait to Abu Dhabi to know if Logan Sargent has a super license. And as far as I'm concerned, Logan's not as good a driver as Nick is. So at the end of the day, we don't have any evidence, at the whole F2,
like at this point within Formula One either, to suggest that he would be anywhere near the pace that Nick could bring. Like, you're going in with obviously not a known thing, but somewhat of a known thing in terms of potential and natural with that car, to complete unknown. And again, going back to that question of a super license, and again, why can't I have one?
Well, at the end of the day, the comparison is in F2 itself. I know 2019 and 2022 aren't the same seasons, but Nick de Vries won Formula 2 in 2019. Logan Sargent hasn't won this year. So I think, look, this whole conversation about having an American driver is an exciting one. You know, we've had that with Christian Horner and Red Bull, looking at Colton Herta. We're having a chat about it with Logan Sargent. But let's not forget, Logan Sargent was doing a phenomenal job in Formula 3 a couple of years ago and then really dropped off. And we haven't really spoken much about him as a Formula One community up until very recently. So I think we'll probably see in the next couple of weeks where Pierre Gasly goes, where de Vries will end up, and where Danny Rick goes. I think we're probably 2 or 3 weeks away from knowing that full picture. And when it comes to Gotifi, he's kind of, as we've sort of been saying the last couple of weeks anyway, we already sort of assumed that he wasn't getting the seat for 2023. So, look, let's see what crashes he can do to cause safety cars at inopportune times to see who can win the championship or not this weekend.
Well, there is a tradition of safety cars at Singapore, so I reckon that he could be in with a slingshot chance here to just go straight into a wall at one point. A Singapore slingshot into the wall for Gotifi, and that would send you out in a high. Sticking around, though, next year is Yuki. So Yuki Tsunoda announced, again, I don't think a huge surprise to a lot of people, but still quite an interesting one. Again, just kind of results, if you list them out, he's quite unpredictable, I would say, or he doesn't have that consistency that we've seen from his teammate, for example, this superb driver that is Pierre Gasly. Were you surprised to see that they've confirmed Yuki for next year, or is that a no-brainer for you?
Not in the slightest, to be honest. I mean, to be honest, I don't think Red Bull had much of a choice with who they were going to put in that second seat. I know there's my tinfoil beanie theory about Danny Rick going to Red Bull and Sergio being demoted to AlphaTauri and everything else. I mean, that was absolutely just nonsense. Let's be clear.
I'm still here for it.
Probably very, very emotionally driven. Look, as I said this a while ago, I think if Danny Rick ends up out of the sport for next year and I end up doing some work with Formula One, it won't be such a bad thing for me because I won't have an emotional attachment to a driver. Whereas at the moment, that's all I do with Daniel. But I just don't think so, because the Colton Herta thing was secured a couple of days ago with, them saying, well, super license points, too bad. You're not going to get it. Red Bull had said, okay, we're not going to pursue that at all now as an avenue. So maybe the only thing that I think would happen is that Nick de Vries goes to AlphaTauri because Pierre Gasly goes to Alpine. And Gasly is sort of saying at the moment and yesterday that he'll know his future in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Well, he's already signed for AlphaTauri, so
it's
commentary
bizarre.
like that makes me think that there's other things going on in here. So I think for that seat for AlphaTauri, it kind of sounds to me that they're going to want some consistency, right? So there's no one in the Red Bull Junior program that's as good as Yuki. Insofar as they haven't raced that AlphaTauri in the same way as you were saying between Logan Sargent and Nick de Vries. De Vries has raced now in that Williams, so people can see his statistics. Yuki's getting better. Is he ever going to be driving for Red Bull? No. Is next year probably his last year in Formula One? Yes. So I think Red Bull is sort of saying, okay, well, let's just keep some consistency there. We don't know what's happening with Pierre Gasly yet. If Gasly goes to Alpine, De Vries potentially goes to AlphaTauri, and then Logan Sargent maybe has a look at that Williams seat, but there's still so much that we don't know. And one of the things, I mean, I'm getting pretty over the driver market, to be honest. I think it was really interesting for maybe a week or two, but then the conspiracy theories and the ridiculousness and the fake headlines and these fake news websites and all these fake Twitter accounts and all this other stuff, like it's just becoming too much. At the end of the day, until we have something with a verified blue check mark, and no, Campy, that's not me in my Instagram profile. I wish you'd stop bringing that up. I'm not really that interested in having one, because even then people like me would have been posted. I have absolutely no idea. So unless we know from a verified source, and I'm not talking about the race or Autosport or anyone else, it's basically Chris Medland. If you don't follow Chris Medland on Twitter, you should, because he's probably got his ear closest to the ground and is very well respected as a journalist by a lot of Formula One teams. Michael Laminato or F1 official, don't bother talking about it, because it's just absolute nonsense until we actually know something about it.
But we're all experts when we're given the microphone, James. Like that's what we're here for.
bloody podcasters, I tell you what, anyone can start a Formula One podcast, and I wish they wouldn't.
Exactly. And they're all idiots. So, no, it's interesting with Yuki. Like you said, I wouldn't mind being the last year. Next year is his last year. But I hope he has some consistency and feels like he's achieved something with his career, because I think he is someone who is at risk of kind of being really brutal, just not doing a lot. And I just think that he's someone who has there's a bit of potential there. Maybe he's not in the right environment. I don't know. We've kind of seen that it took him a while to be able to control a lot of the kind of the energy and the emotion and everything else that comes with this type of elite performance. He talks a lot about that in terms of having to actually understand that side of things, and you can't just go out and race and hope that it all goes well. So I hope that he has enough time to kind of put those learnings and that development into action, but I think he's only got a year really left to do that. But like you said, depending on what's going on with that other seat, they might be after some consistency. But it is bizarre when you've got somebody who has a signed contract for next year saying, I'll know what's happening in a couple of weeks. And you're there just thinking, it just shows how, how quickly things can change no matter if someone's already put pen to paper, and you're like, these, contracts don't seem to be, worth the paper that they're printed on. But
it's like the goggles, the contracts, they do nothing.
They do nothing. Indeed. All right, let's keep moving on away from driver market and thinking about this weekend and some other news. First of all, sprint races. So they've said that from next year there will be 6 events from 2023 onwards, sprint races. Now, I think I'm maybe in the minority of people who quite enjoy a sprint weekend. However, I think it is very dependent on the track, in that I think there are certain tracks and layouts that suit this style of format. There's others that don't. Like, I think Monza sprint race last year worked really well, and there were others which I think, that they worked really well. There's others which didn't, and I wouldn't want to see any more than 6. Although if they get up to the probably 50 races that they want to have in 2024, then half of those will be sprints. But with a 24 race calendar, 6 in my view is not too many. It's more dependent on which tracks they're at. What are your thoughts on the sprint format?
Look, I really like the sprint race format, to be honest, because I think from a fan point of view, or what Formula One's trying to do to engage new people, no one really cares about free practice. You don't know what the teams are doing. The times don't mean anything to anyone. It is purely for them to figure out car setup and understand upgrades and all that sort of other stuff. And whilst that is important, it's not a very exciting television to watch. More often than not, what we've seen with the last couple of sprint races is that they've been more interesting than the actual Grand Prix themselves. So to have these mini races or qualifying sessions in this way, I think is fine, as you say, so long as the tracks are the correct tracks. And out of the 24 races that we've got next year, for me, there's only 15 tracks on the calendar that I'm excited for or about. So hopefully it's one of those 15. But it's going to end up like V8 supercars. With the amount of points on offer with 6 sprint races and 24 races, they're going to be saying, Max Verstappen's won the championship on 104,273 points, like V8 Supercars has this ridiculous point strategy because we're going racing so often and there's so many points being awarded. So I think so long as they figure out exactly where the points are made, where the qualifying positions are, that is maybe needs to be adjusted a little bit from this year. I think that this year's a lot better than last year. Who gets like trophies and all that sort of other stuff, I think it'll be fine. But from a fan's point of view, and certainly from a new fan's point of view, sprint racing is great. And if you don't like it, you don't have to watch it. There's so many other races you can watch through the year.
Yeah, well, exactly. Pick any other weekend and you'll find a race. I think the bigger issue is that there's just too many races, and it kind of goes back to that. So if you only had, 16, 18 races and 3 of those were sprints, it would be a much better balance than having 6 and 24. I don't know, it's my opinion. But I think it is quite good for spectators. I know not everyone agrees with me. It is a very kind of divisive point. And I was kind of flicking through some of the comments on the F1 kind of Instagram and stuff. And, why let's go find something that's not broken and just break it. And like, hey, F1, where did you go? All of these things. I'm like, I actually don't hate it. I think it does make for a more exciting weekend. I think where you get in trouble is also if any of those fall on like in the triple headers or something like that, you go, whoa, that's a lot now. All of a sudden, throwing in that type of prep, and then obviously not a full race, but still those racing conditions for drivers that becomes a lot. So I think they just have to plan it very, very carefully in terms of where they are from a track perspective, but then when they fall in terms of the calendar as well. Let's keep moving. McLaren, they are pink this weekend. Just sling a Singapore pink paint at the car, apparently. Although I have to say that their race suits are giving me Red Bull vibes. But I think it looks pretty cool. As much as I'm not being terribly kind about it, I actually quite enjoy the pink feature. for the weekend. It could look quite good under lights as well, depending on how it's actually designed. I don't know. And it'll be here for a couple of weekends, so we'll get to see it a few times. Do you like the look of it?
Yeah, I think it looks fine. I'm not necessarily sure about the sponsor, and I don't really like the ad they did with DR for that. That was just all kinds of weird.
The magician one.
Anyway, but just the animatronic
Yeah,
honey
it's
badger
bizarre.
in the car, and whoever wrote that just needs to get off whatever they're on. But anyway, good advertising decision, guys. Yeah, I mean, it's fine, right? The liveries change all the time. I think under lights it's going to look pretty good. It'll be interesting to see what it looks like in the daytime around Japan. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is, right?
It is what it is indeed. So we've slung back to Singapore. We haven't been here, as we mentioned earlier, since 2019. I love this track personally. I think, and what's really interesting is that through the press conferences and things like that this weekend, what's really evident is how much the drivers love this track. The way they described it in terms of saying there's just no room for mistakes. It's a night race, obviously, which makes it different. It's the longest race. You know, staying alert is really challenging. It's hot. It's a street circuit. But because of all of that is a very high sense of reward, which I think is just an interesting element to understand from the drivers in terms of going, yeah, there's races which might be, not as hard work, both physically and mentally challenging from them, but then it's not as high reward as well. So there's obviously something going on there when it comes to the competitive nature and feeling like they've kind of tackled some beast when it comes to this track. So I'm looking forward to it because I think it makes for better racing when they all want to be there and they're enjoying the race too. An interesting weekend in that if Max wins and Charles finishes 8th or below, then he wins the championship. Oh, and Perez finishes. Oh, no, wait. And so, sorry, maths has already done me. I get so frustrated with this thing where it's like, Max can win the championship here. And you're going, okay, let's just work at the back points here and the backtracking and everything else. And it's like if A, B, C, D, and E come into place. And it's actually not that complicated with this. But he doesn't, do you know what's really interesting is watching him talk, he doesn't look like he thinks that he's winning here either. He's gone I'm not thinking about it. Here. We're just going to keep doing what we've done all season and focusing on one weekend at a time. I'm not convinced it's going to happen purely because there are so many things that need to line up, including how Charles performs. And I think they could potentially have a good weekend. But let's have a chat about some other drivers as well. We've got Albon back, maybe. So this I thought was interesting. He's there. He's obviously at press conferences and talking and that type of thing and said, I've been karting and it feels okay. But the thing is that after, and again, I speak like a medical profession to be clear, I'm not. But it's one thing to allow your body to recover from surgery. It's another to allow your lungs to recover from being ventilated. Like that is a huge amount of pressure and stress on your body. And this is, as they've all explained, one of the toughest races of the season from that perspective, like from a lung stress perspective. That is one of the things that makes it really hard. But then also limited mobility as well, which is going to be really, really challenging. But listening to the way he actually spoke at the press conference, it was quite careful. It was kind of, we'll see how I feel after free practice. And if I feel good, then I'll race. But I actually think he's still 50-50. He didn't look as well as he usually does. Let's put it that way.
I want Jack Aitken to race this Grand Prix, to be honest. He's actually the reserve driver for Williams. I think the only reason Nick De Vries got the drive is because he was driving an Aston Martin earlier in the weekend. So I think, Jack's performance in Bahrain when George went up to the Mercedes, when Lewis had COVID, was great. And that was an absolutely back of the pack car, and he still put a pretty decent performance in. I think he's also pulled the dance move of the week, which was like spinning on the last corner, able to get into pits to put some new tyres into it, which just looked good. But yeah, it'd be good to see Jack, I think, in that car. I think he or Nick would still struggle around this track anyway. There's just no way that you can put the performance in that a Formula One driver who's been training all year long will be able to have that kind of endurance. So I don't think Albon should race, to be honest. I don't think he needs to. There's no point him damaging himself further for him to struggle along in the car next year. He's got a contract for next year. Williams and Yost are very happy with him. The board's happy with him. His seat is not under threat. It'd be better for him to just sit out for for a race
just
weekend.
take the rest of the season.
Take the rest of the season. But even if he did, it wouldn't matter because he could still come back and show to Formula One that he deserves that place. So, yeah, I don't think he should race, to be honest. He has nothing to prove. I think he's more than capable of driving a Formula One car. Teams know that. And whether or not his long-term strategy is with Williams or with Red Bulls or whatever it is, that's fine. But I think he just needs to focus on recovering because what a scary situation that was for him to have that and then being in the ICU for a while too. Just no good. So I think his main focus should be looking after himself because whoever replaces him as a reserve driver will be going for the seat that's next to him in the number 6 car anyway, not for his seat. So I wouldn't worry too much if I were him.
Yeah, I tend to feel the same way, especially given what it is that is difficult about this track in terms of the humidity and that type of thing. And, these cars take a completely different toll on their bodies that they've been describing because they're so stiff and much harder to kind of wrangle in comparison to previous years' designs. So, I kind of feel the same way actually in terms of just – they're just never going to, right? If they have any inkling that they think they'll be okay, they're going to put themselves out there. I think sometimes it's very easy though to kind of – lose perspective on those situations. But sticking with Williams, obviously we've discussed Latifi, not signing for next year, not really any surprises. And he's kind of acknowledged that, look, this is obviously the first time that he's come out since that news broke. But he said, look, I understand it's not the results that they've hoped to have seen. I would love to have kept on the journey with them, but look, I'm just going to focus on the last couple of races and then hopefully ending on a high. Too early to say what's next for him, but he kind of said, that triple header break, as it turned out to be, with the Russia race cancelled, actually came at a really good time for him to be able to process that and now just be able to come back and enjoy his last few races. Going back to McLaren, they've got a new livery and there's also going to be some upgrades as well this weekend. They will be on Lando's car, but not on Daniel Ricciardo's car. Lando's kind of, in talking about Singapore, feels like it's pretty difficult to put a lap together here and just get everything right. He's like, sometimes you get 1 or 2 bits and pieces right, but having the whole thing come together is really difficult, but that's why it's so rewarding because it's one of the hardest places to do that. So there's quite a big upgrade package on his car. I think they've kind of said in the way of floor and side pods and all sorts of things, but it won't be on DR's car. He will hopefully get them in Japan, but he kind of very cheekily said, well, maybe I want them in Japan, but maybe I don't. What if they don't work? What if they're fast, then I look forward to it. But if not, then you can hold on to them, which I thought was, he had an interesting kind of way of talking about, the differences in discussion there. But again, he's just such a professional when it comes to those types of things. He just said, look, this is all gearing towards 2023. Lando's going to be racing for McLaren. I won't be. So, again, nothing personal. It just is what it is. But he's got a pretty big smile on his face this weekend. Actually, I think he likes racing here from what he's saying this weekend. And he said, I'm ready to pleasantly suffer, so to speak, because it is one of the toughest races. But, he's never won here though. He's come second here a few times, but seems to be in pretty good spirits, I thought.
Yeah, it makes absolute sense for McLaren to put those upgrades on Lando's car and not on Daniel's. There is, and as much as we all love Daniel on this podcast, there is absolutely no reason for McLaren to invest in DR and his performance for the rest of his career with McLaren. That's just a fact. And if you can't process that or you think it's a conspiracy, just settle down, honestly, because it's not. It just makes absolute sense with budget caps and understanding the car. And yeah, I mean, the future is in Lando, and let's hope that the upgrade packages do work so that when Oscar jumps in the car, he has the ability to perform well there too. One thing I would say is that whatever upgrades are brought to the McLaren, it's not going to help Daniel because whatever was fundamentally wrong with the car from the beginning of his time in Bahrain in 2021 rather, to this new car, he's still not been able to get his head around it. I don't think a significant upgrade package is going to help him in that respect. So I think the reason he's buoyant is because he's spent the last couple of weeks in Perth. So he's been at home, hanging out with his family, hanging out with his parents, and really just trying to get back into a good zone. Of course, he's going to be under a little bit of pressure by himself, trying to figure out, he and his management anyway, about what's happening with him for next year. So if he can enjoy himself on track and have some good on-track performances, then I think that's great. I mean, he is very good at, as you say, being professional and trying to rise above it. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw him really struggle with this weekend, because if you don't have total confidence in the car, there is absolutely no way you're putting a mega lap in. We're probably going to see some DRS trains as well. So it's going to be unfortunate. So I think he just needs to enjoy all of the things around the Grand Prix weekend and not actually the performance of the car for the weekend.
It does seem likely, like you said, if it's like many of the other street tracks, you just have to trust you have that full confidence in the car to be able to put it on the limit, and he hasn't been able to do that all season, so I don't really see why it would change here, even if he's in a better mood. But that also comes from things being known, right? Because even once that news broke, he would have known that for a little while. And I think when you're holding on to stuff like that, it's going to make you very uncomfortable in front of the camera. And generally speaking, unlikely to be your usual self. So it was good to see that, because he did seem to have a bit of a shift in his demeanour this weekend. And if nothing else, you hope that he has a good weekend with everything else that surrounds Grand Prix. Moving on to Mercedes. So we've got Lewis here, 4-time winner, loves it. He has complained about ride quality here in the past, which, given the Mercedes performance this season, could be a bit of a concern for them, in that they're probably in for a bit of a bumpy ride. But they have got some of that sorted, and obviously the new technical directive has affected that somewhat. George definitely sounds like they're banking on a safety car, which, to be fair, is historically likely based on this track. And hey, Latifi is still here for the rest of the season.
Exactly.
But it'll be interesting to see how they go. I reckon they could be up for challenging this weekend, actually. I don't know. There's something about their confidence, how the car has actually made some massive improvements throughout the year. Like, they're not in the same position of others who kind of came out on a high and then haven't really done much. They have been figuring out their problems very effectively, which is interesting because we weren't sure that was going to happen. And we talked about that earlier in the year in terms of whether or not we thought that Mercedes would be able to sort themselves out, and if they had the kind of capacity from an organisational perspective to solve those problems and have to work very differently with things like the cost cap being imposed on them. So, I think they could be in for a good weekend. And the other thing as well that would help with that is I think they've resurfaced different parts of the track as well to try and reduce the bumpiness and improve the ride quality there for them. So that could be helping Mercedes this weekend, given that that's one of the concerns that they've been sharing. It's
a street circuit. Of course it's bumpy. It's like legitimately actually a street circuit though, unlike, Jeddah and even
fake Miami
Park,
car park.
It's exactly right. Like, it's actually the streets of Singapore, which is so good in so many different ways. So there'll be a lot of bumps, and that's just is what it is. It's fine. I think they're just going to have to deal with it, and it's part of this track. And I mean, Lewis was complaining about that when the cars weren't porpoising. So it'll be interesting to see what, they do. Yeah. But as you say, with the new technical regulations and everything else, I think the porpoising will be fine. It'll still be bumpy and, whatever. They'll just have to get over it and move on.
Yeah. Two, who's moving on to his 350th race, no less, is Alonso. Like, what a star. It's a big weekend for him. And they've both got new floors, which, they were interesting for Alpine in that when they've brought upgrades throughout the season, they seem to have worked, which is not the same for every team when they've brought upgrades along and everyone gets excited and then nothing happens. That hasn't been the case for Alpine. They do seem to understand their car really well, and when they bring upgrades, they seem to have an effect. But a big weekend for him. He posted something on his Instagram, actually just being absolutely swamped by supporters. Doesn't look like he'll have a moment to himself this weekend. Tell you though, who hasn't raced here is Mick. He's never raced here. So while you've got other people approaching their 350th race, he hasn't actually raced here. So he's going to be relying on Sims quite significantly, and of course what other people are telling him, which you kind of mentioned, is that I've been asking the other guys what it's like in combination with doing obviously his own time in the simulator. So it's always interesting, I think, when you have somebody on the track for the first time, because they're coming in at it from a completely different angle. But yeah, different weekend for him, of course, as well. But let's get into everyone's favourite part of Freya's Free Practice Fridays. I can't even get my own name right for this thing.
None of us can.
None of us can. Unfortunately, the Phlegm Free Fridays was rolling off the tongue most easily, but that was
also a great
ruined
joke
when
that you
Campy
made.
came and joined me.
Well, and he completely missed the joke as well, which was also hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, just wait a minute, mate. Let me finish my joke, and you can
take a couple of seconds to sink in. And there it is. Good.
Yep. Very good. So our profile for this weekend is Ruth. Oh my gosh, why can't I speak? Ruth Buscombe. Now, this was actually a recommendation. We asked our patrons, who would you like us to profile on this podcast? And this is one of the names that came up. So we're very happy to be going through her background and talking about her role as the head of race strategy for Alfa Romeo. So who is she? She is, like I said, the head of race strategy for Alfa Romeo at the moment, Formula One team. She, quote unquote, went from wanting to be a princess to being an astronaut to wanting to be in F1, and all of that very rapidly by the time she was 11. So I think I'd actually gone from like ballerina to like literally wanting to be like a rally car driver by the time I was about 16. But to go princess, astronaut, working in F1 by the time you're 11 is some pretty clear directive.
It's efficient.
It is efficient, much like she is, I would say, in many ways. And she says that she was pretty single-minded as a kid, and, you know, like I said, from age 11, she just wanted to work in F1. So her dad was a big McLaren fan, which she said he came to terms with after she got her first job at Ferrari. He said, "Oh, okay, well, if you have to work in F1, that's not so bad." But he would take her down to Silverstone, and she said, you know, it was just one of those things that just clicked with me, in that it was a perfect combination of things which I loved, which was maths and competition. So this is something we talk about a little bit when we're profiling different people working in F1, is how it creates this perfect kind of meeting of things that you're good at when it comes to aptitudes, for example, and then things that you actually really enjoy doing, things like sport, like competition. And this was certainly the case for her by everything she describes in terms of what she's loved. And she said, look, at the time I was making those things combined through doing mathletes. And then when I learned that you could go and work in Formula One as an engineer, she was like, okay, yeah, that's a bit cooler. That's a bit cooler than mathletes. Maybe I'll do that. But the other thing which is interesting with people who are kind of, I suppose, at this age, you know, people who are not kind of entering the sport now straight out of university, is how they found out what to go and do in order to work in F1, because you didn't have idiots like me profiling people and saying this is what they went and did, and creating that information kind of chain for other people. Not to say that that's how people would go and learn how to get into F1, but you know, information was not as easy to find. But what she did do, she's like, you know, Google was around, and I literally just looked up James Allison and Paddy Lowe and just said, well, what did they do? And so both of them went to Cambridge. They did aerospace and aerothermal engineering, and she said, cool. Well, I'll just do that then. And obviously, so James Allen, who's now Chief Technical Officer at Mercedes, Paddy Lowe, who has been between Williams, McLaren, Mercedes, and back to Williams, and is now running his own technology business making synthetic fuels. But for her, in terms of where they were at their careers and where she was looking to go, she literally said that. And there's a great interview with her on Beyond the Grid. Is that what it's called? Yeah, Beyond the Grid. And they said, you know, how did you pick those two? What was it about them? And she goes, oh, no, they were literally the first two to come up on Google. So that's how I decided. Which I think we should all just build into our decision making a little bit more often in terms of first two things to come up on Google. Let's just go do it.
I mean, that's fair enough. If you're in Australia, if you search F1 podcast, we're the first result. So I am fully supportive of that.
Very good point. Very good point. Exactly. Just follow the first couple of things to arrive in your search engine. So she went and did what James and Paddy did. Cool, I'll do that too. So off she goes to Cambridge University, first class honours as a graduate from the Department of Engineering. Now, really interestingly, her thesis project, so they do these master's collaborations often between F1 and the FIA and the universities. So hers was on the DRS zones. So they was still very new when she was at university and was trying to figure out what the impact was essentially on races, depending on how they set the DRS zones and all that time. I'm simplifying this massively, obviously. But a lot of that involved simulating different races and considering the effect on strategy and what that would mean when it comes to Formula One racing. And I just find it fascinating listening to what these now professional engineers and strategists were studying with things that are now on track and that we're kind of living as part of our own race weekends. So that was what she studied, and part of that for her was a collaboration with the FIA in order to understand what impact they would have on the racing, and that helped her to understand that what strategy meant basically when it came to Formula One, and that was something that she kind of said, okay, maybe that's where I'll start targeting my efforts when it comes to working in F1 is actually through strategy. So people tried to lead her down the simulation path, but she knew that strategy was where it's at. So out of university, she got her first job at Ferrari, which, like I said, I think by the sounds of her interviews, broke her McLaren fan dad's heart, but came to terms with over time. And then eventually she did, step up to the role of race strategist with Ferrari, then moved on to Haas to become the team's strategy engineer. She made this move. She describes it in terms of just really understanding that she wanted to grow, she wanted to advance, and that didn't seem like it was going to be a possibility for her in the near future at Ferrari, but also that she wanted to be trackside. So she had been factory-based for the most part and really wanted to be trackside. So the two things that really drove that move to Haas for her, one was growth and advancement, and the second one was wanting to be trackside. So after Haas, she then went on to Sauber. Now, in those two moves, there's some really important career moments. They're kind of nested in there, which I wanted to talk about briefly. So the first one was Malaysia in 2015. So this is Vettel's first win with Ferrari. They had lost their head of strategy at the start of that race, so at the start of that season, and they had a new one coming in.
Have they ever found strategy again? Have they ever found them?
Yes, I was about to say, and we're still waiting for the replacement.
And we're still looking for them.
Exactly. So they had lost their head of strategy at the start of that season, and we're waiting for a new one to come in. I think it was around kind of their third or fourth race for the season. But she said, we basically had the B team kind of left holding the Italian strategy baby for several races. And she said for a brief moment there, a lot of responsibility kind of fell on people who wouldn't usually have that, which in and of itself is just interesting to see how people respond to being given that type of responsibility, which they wouldn't be used to, and how you kind of step up to that, how you handle it and that type of thing. But they ended up having to make intense decisions under pressure, which they wouldn't usually have been under, and they had to decide whether or not to stay out, come in and pit. And she was the one who actually had to make that call and say, nope, staying out, we're doing a two-stop. And she said, that was the right thing to do, which helped them to beat Mercedes in that race, which was her call. And she said, they asked me a couple of times. It wasn't what should we do, and gave them the answer, and off they went. They came back and they said, are you sure? And she said, you really just have to back yourself in that moment. And she'd been there for 4 years at that point, and she said, look, being a British woman working for Ferrari, you don't always feel a strong sense of belonging. And then when they asked me that question multiple times, I still didn't feel a strong sense of belonging. But when it worked, that was when I felt like I belonged. It was in that moment and after that win. So just a really interesting kind of opportune moment, I suppose, for her to demonstrate that kind of ability and conviction more than anything else. The other big career moment nested in those moves was going to Haas and 2016, which was their first race as a new team with Romain Grosjean, and they finished sixth. And she said, I still can't decide if this is a good decision or bad decision. I think it was a good decision, but she slept on the floor the night before. And she said basically it was my first time ever trackside. I had never been trackside with a Formula One team in this role. So first time trackside, new software, new team, first time doing the job. And the night before she'd worked through to 6 a.m. and she had to be back at the track by 8. And so back to your point of efficiency, James, she just said, well, I was going to lose commute time by going back to the hotel. So I figured I would just sleep on the floor. But she goes, hey, we're a new team. All of the overalls were new, so it was fine. They made a great blanket.
Oh, goodness.
I know, right? But again, similar decision where she said we had to decide whether or not to stay out. And she said, again, just made the right call in that moment. She's like, I was sure based on simulations I had done that the red flag was going to happen. And that's exactly what did happen. We made the right call. We were able to change on the red flag. And that was for her. She goes, it wasn't even about having made the right decision in that moment, and therefore helping Romain to get a great result with points in their first race as a new team, as much as the personal challenge of that day in terms of everything we've already listed. New team, new role, new software, still figuring things out. And she said the engineers and mechanics were doing everything they can to try and get her to do like a no pit stop race, because she said we'd had such little pit stop practice that they were like, no, stop, no, stop, no, stop. And so when she said, this is a situation that you're working under, to have made the right call, but to have overcome that day, which for her was just such a massive personal and professional challenge, is something that she looks back on as being a really important moment for her.
Haas and pit stops just do not go together in 2016, 17 or 18, honestly. What a disaster.
Yeah, but she moved from Haas. That was a fairly short kind of stint, and then went on to Sauber. So this is what I wanted to get stuck into a little bit, which was her, I suppose, attitude when it comes to the role of a strategist. And this was, I just find it very, it's quite fascinating to listen to different people doing the same roles in different teams, because they do talk about it quite differently. And we talked about that in terms of the size of the team, how the different people work together, who actually makes the decisions and their roles, and how they affect the people around them. Because they do all kind of share different views on it. And the fundamentals are probably there, but their experience and their attitudes towards the role that they play in a team is quite different. But for her, the way she describes being a strategist is that your job is just to facilitate the best possible decision-making and make them in a timely manner. So 2 things: best possible decision in an efficient way. That's as simple as it is, James, when it comes to being a strategist in Formula One.
Do you have to have an English accent when you talk about it, though?
Yeah, we do. You absolutely do. And she has a great anecdote about the Brits, which I'm going to come back to on that note. But what she does share, which is very similar to others, is just how early all of the planning starts before a race. She said, it can be up to 12, 13 weeks before a race actually happens, that they're running through simulations and gathering all of their data and understanding what the different possibilities will be. And in terms of how that has changed over even her time in Formula One, is just how much more live data they're getting. So she's saying, even during winter testing, the tyre data and what everyone is running, so we used to have to go out there and actually manually spot which tyres other people were using, and then go and look at the data that we had to see what was going on. So from a software perspective, that's one of the biggest changes that she's seen evolve. More plugins, better simulations, more powerful computing, allowing them to make better predictions and those types of things. And obviously for her, all of those things means that her role has completely changed quite dramatically when it comes to the strategies itself. You know, it's like when you can predict more, when the computations are more powerful, strategies evolve. And of course, every time someone does something, that then gets added to the playbook. So you're constantly trying to come up with new and different ideas. Again, just an interesting way of thinking about strategy in terms of, you have this playbook of, well, this team did this in 2014 and that worked really well in the wet, but it didn't in the dry. So how can we add that to our repertoire? Not something I'd never necessarily thought about, I don't think.
And I think it's interesting because we play it off, from a media point of view, it's like, oh, we expect it to be a two-stop race, or Ferrari are useless with strategy, whatever else. Like from the outside, it's very easy to dismiss, but simple, just box him now or box him later or box him whenever. But there's so much more to it because of all of the other things. I mean, best laid plans, first encounter with the enemy, they all completely go out of the window. And so you really always need to have the playbook of what to do when stuff goes in a completely different direction to what you were expecting, and that's half of expecting that whole plan, right? So Ruth and Hannah and a whole bunch of other people who make these decisions, when it does come off, like you were saying with what she did with Ferrari, then they go, oh, it's fantastic. But it's so easy to bin them, even though they probably made all the right decisions with all of the data that they had in front of them at the time. It's just they either got played by a safety car or one of the other strategists maybe saw something that they didn't. And as you say, once that's done, though, that's it. You can't use that, special play again, especially not the next weekend, because people will be thinking about it. So it's such an incredible thing. And her head must be just so full of all of the things all of the time from all of the races she's ever done.
Yeah, I love that. So here's what it means in our books to be a race strategist. You have to be good at making decisions quickly and be able to have a head full of things. That's really what it comes down to.
Technical terms.
But the other technical terms. The other thing which I thought was interesting here is, again, how she sees her role in the team. So she said, we are there to deploy a team game plan. And, that can change in terms of what your plan is how close you are to your nearest rivals. That can change depending on where you are in the championship, how competitive your car is, how individuals and the team might be placed. And, is it likely to be a track that suits your rivals? So are we now in a kind of defensive space in comparison to how our car is performing, or is this a track where we are likely to be able to kind of make some more strategic moves? But it is not the job of the strategist to decide what the game is. So you said, you've got this team game, someone else decides what it is. Our job is to tell people how to deliver it. And here are the different ways in which you can deliver it. So for example, if the team principal says, right, our job this weekend is to maximize points with both drivers, how can we do it? And she'll say, okay, we go now and look at our simulations and little calculations that we run and what we think is likely to happen. And we'll go, here's plan A, B, and C. But it's not our job to decide that that's what they should be doing that weekend in terms of trying to maximize the point with both drivers. They might on other weekends say, no, we're very much prioritising driver A over driver B. And you said, it's our job to then tell them how to do that, or what it might actually be about the different ways in which you could go about it. And she said, look, yeah, it is. Sometimes it is just about one driver. So it might, how do we use our second driver in that weekend to stop another team who we know are likely to be very strong? Like, are we going in for a defensive mechanism that weekend? Absolutely. So again, just being really transparent with that, but then also how she sees her role, I thought was quite interesting. But then again, she said, but when it comes down to that weekend, as you say, she's like, I want it to be 98% preparation and then with just enough space to react. But the aim still is not to be running live calculations. You just don't have time for that and people aren't informed. So you're essentially just descending through decision-making approaches as the race changes, but you're prepared for every one of those changes to approach. But the other elements of elements of her job, she's also part of the Pirelli working group when it comes to providing feedback after events. And this is something that she seems to be quite passionate about in the way that, listening to the way that she talks about it, in terms of saying, this is a way that I can kind of impact races of the future, so to speak, because we give feedback after events, which can then change tyre allocation for following years, and that type of thing. So she said, there's a group of us who then go and give that feedback to Pirelli, and she said, we found that the tyres behaved in this way in this temperature. I think next year you could probably, try a softer tyre and they might actually last better than we thought they would based on the performance under this temperature and that type of thing. So she's part of a working group whose goal is to constantly improve the races of the future from that perspective. So we're not all just sitting here talking about how no one could get heat into their tyres and people are spinning out of pit lanes.
Yeah.
So again, just interesting to hear about how all of these roles, yes, they've got their roles in the teams, but then they're also helping to evolve the sport and the races that we'll see, on the 700 races of next year's calendar.
It's one of the things that honestly, genuinely really love this addition to our lineup. And I think it's and I'm glad that we've done Ruth so quickly after Hannah too, because it's such a big part of the world of Formula One that from a podcast point of view, we've just never really gone into before. But from a listener point of view, and the couple that you've done where I have been able to listen and edit whilst you've smashed me, bloody
You're welcome.
Swearing and everything else. No. It's been really good. And Campy certainly isn't. So I think it's really interesting to understand this sort of stuff. And I mean, there's plenty of other people in the paddock that I can't wait for you to profile as well. But from a listener point of view, I think, and as we go through the next couple of races, it's so good for us as fans of the sport too to have this little bit of extra knowledge, to be thinking about this when we see a safety car come out, and with the knowledge that it's not just the drivers and it's not just the race engineers, it's this whole suite of other people. And regardless, Ruth might sit on the pit wall, she might sit in the garage, but there's the whole suite of team back at Sauber at headquarters as well who are doing similar things as you spoke about with Hannah, and the ability for them to sort of go back to the factory or be trackside to be able to do these things. I think it's awesome. There's so much more to this sport than just the drivers, just Christian Horner and Toto Wolff and Gunther Steiner, and just, Bono, my tyres are gone, or Brad.
Yeah. As much as we love it, and it's a bet that I'm happy to make as to how quickly Lewis's Hamilton's tyres go. But that's an interesting point, right? And you talk about, coming up to this weekend, and we're saying, what might Alfa Romeo try? Well, listening to interviews with people like Ruth, like Hannah, actually gives you some insight to that. So Ruth, when talking about, the different types of strategies, they ask her questions like, do you have to change a strategy according to driver, or, obviously according to team when you're on the championship? She's like, yeah, but what the fun part is? And she uses this kind of stock analogy in a lot of ways, where she's like, your actions and choices need to be proportionate to the risk. So you take more risks when you're starting further down the track, for example, because the reward is so much higher. But if you are literally about to win a championship and you just have to win this race regardless of countback points and everything else and all the maths that I can't do, then you're not going to take big risks on that weekend. Whereas if you have two drivers who you could both get into the points, maybe if you play your cards right, and you might have to try something a bit exotic to get them there, you have not free reign necessarily, but that is a risk that's proportionate to the reward. And so she said that's kind of one of the things that is quite interesting in working with a kind of a midfield team is that, not to say there's less at stake, there is always a lot at stake in Formula One, but you can be more experimental because there is less at stake when it comes to championship points and the like. And I thought that was quite interesting, especially as we're going straight into a weekend like this one. Again, it is a street circuit. It might see some interesting kind of pit stop strategies and that type of thing. You're thinking about that stuff in terms of going, I wonder if they're going to try something that they haven't done before and see how that plays out. And you do hear some drivers talking about that quite a bit, but The other thing which I thought was fascinating, and we picked this up a little bit, was just how much knowledge the strategists have of other drivers' strengths and weaknesses, because this is not just an attacking game, it's also a defensive game. And she said, no one does a pit entry like Hamilton. And she's like, no one finds lines like Max. He's the only one who will find certain lines. So we know that there's certain ways that we wouldn't or would try and defend against him. Some drivers are really good when it comes to blue flags. Others don't seem to be able to handle them very well. So she's like, you need to know how and what to push others to kind of best exploit their weaknesses. So I think that's something that I probably found not entirely surprising, but perhaps how much of a focus it was understanding other people's game plans, and not necessarily game plans, but the strengths within those and how they're playing to them in order to best develop their own from a defensive strategy perspective. But
yeah, and again, it's not like just knowing your whole team. It's knowing the other 18 drivers on the grid too, as you say, and even blue flags. So what's Latifi going to do? Is there going to be Canadian on Canadian crime here when Valtteri is trying to get past, or if they're lapping or whatever else? And again, it just adds so much more data and thought process to try and make those decisions. So again, it just highlights how much work these guys have to do, constantly thinking lap to lap, where we can just go, it's lap 74 and I'm bored.
Well, hopefully it's not like that this weekend, because it is going to be a long race. But just before we wrap up on Ruth, there are two things I wanted to mention. One is that we do always talk about when we are profiling, highlighting a female who's working in motorsport, is some of the work that they're doing to promote women working in the industry. And she is an ambassador for Dare to be Different, and is doing a lot of work around that, like many of the other women who we've been talking about recently. And again, I think one of the things I think is important for us to bring to people's attention is where they feel the challenges are. So for her, she talks about, not dissimilarly from some of the others, right back at school. And she said, I did have teachers kind of trying to dissuade me from doing engineering, not because I wasn't good at it, because they questioned whether or not it was something that I actually wanted to do. That to me is mind-blowing. The idea of kind of going, you're really good at this thing, but I'm going to still question whether or not are you sure you really want to do that? And she said, that is a thing that we have to change. And she talks about, and she's got this great kind of analogy. She said, Ferrari make these tiny little red plastic cars. And if you go find a kid who's playing with toy cars, you guarantee they're going to have a little red one, and red means Ferrari. So when those people grow up to be millionaires, they want a red Ferrari. It's like you're planting these ideas in people's heads when they're really, really little. So when you are talking to children about what they want to be when they grow up, or the toys that they are presented with to play with, give your girls a bloody race car, give them a screwdriver, or give them things that are going to open the world up to them and not close them off. So I thought that was really cool and an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah. And you mentioned British accent, which I was not actually intending to put on, I don't think, but she has a great anecdote here when it just happened. Started talking about Formula One and became a Brit. She got asked by Tom Clarkson about when they were starting to introduce changes to DRS and DRS zones, whether or not there was pushback from that and how people felt about it. And she said, this is about the British. She goes, yeah, but if you take away our ability to complain about everything, who are we really? And on that note.
And on that, not really bitter disappointment or bombshell.
On that note, we also learned that she's got a fantastic sense of humour. So good on you, Ruth. We love reading about your background and listening to your interviews and learning about the contribution that you're making to this sport and epic career that you're having. So you're an absolute star. Kudos, claps in Campy's words to you.
Geez.
It's
half the stuff this guy says, it's a completely different language, and I just don't think anything is connected here. Kudos, claps. Seriously.
Well, yeah. but clicking while he's doing it. Anyway, it's fine.
Yeah, I know.
That's it from me, James. Is there anything that we haven't talked about in the lead up to Singapore that you wanted to cover off, or have I been babbling along for a long enough time now?
No, I think it's a great summary. I don't think Max Verstappen is winning the championship this weekend. I think it would make better sense for Honda to win the World Championship in Suzuka, Japan. So if anything, they'll probably try and wait. No, I'm kidding. Look, to be honest, I think from a podium point of view, I think we'll probably see Max on the top step.
That is a conspiracy theory I haven't heard yet.
Top step will be Max. I think George will be second and Perez will be third, which will negate any ability with Charles and everything else. I just think Ferrari's strategy will be not so good. I think Mercedes are getting better and better, so we'll probably see Lewis around the 4th, 5th position. I think George has probably just got the edge on Lewis at the moment from a Mercedes point of view. So I think we'll see that. Ferrari will just do Ferrari things. And we haven't had a car catch on fire recently for Ferrari, so that potentially could be Charles's car this time, considering last time that was Carlos.
And
so who knows?
that is also something that happens. That's also something that happens in Singapore. So, it's again, historically, this could be the place to do it. Do you reckon that Lewis is going to get his win this season?
No. I just don't think. I think next year the pace for Mercedes is coming there. I think the first win for Mercedes will come with George, to be honest, more than Lewis. And I don't think it's necessarily he's faster. He just seems to. And Campy used to say this, like Valtteri always had the bad luck in Mercedes and Lewis always had the good luck. I think that's maybe shared now a little bit. But every time there seems to be a safety car, George seems to benefit from it more so than Lewis for this year. So potentially we could see something happen. I mean, Mercedes are really catching the pace. They'll finish second in the championship ahead of Ferrari. That's just the kind of thing that will happen with this team. As you said, they're making significant gains as we go along. I would love for Lewis to do that for this year, but I just don't think it's going to happen. Max is so dominant. And George seems to be so lucky with strategy and everything else that it's going to have to all go right. He's going to have to do, put it on pole and then lead the whole race and do what Lewis is used to doing, which is being out front early and staying there.
I also don't think that George would gift it to him. And not that that's a situation that he would necessarily be in, but I think George they're far more interested in getting a Mercedes win than a Lewis win.
Yep. That
if George was in a position to, even if they could play a strategy in order to hand that to Lewis, I don't think he would do it. So I think I agree. I think that if they're going to get a win this season, I think it's more likely to come with George. And that's partially also Lewis, I think, was testing a lot of stuff earlier in the year when George wasn't. So he actually had a far more stable car for a long time and then played his cards right and kind of just stayed out of trouble. And then he's had some luck when it comes to safety cars and that type of thing. But I think as a team, they're going to be chasing a win, but I'm not convinced that it'll actually be Lewis who gets it. So.
And do you know what? I don't think Lewis would expect George to get out of the way and hand him the win either. Like, I think Lewis would want to win it on track properly, like doing a wheel to wheel, even if it is overtaking George on track, doing it wheel to wheel and not having any team radio, because I think that just delegitimizes the actual victory itself. And I think Lewis has grown a lot as a individual, but also as a racer for this season as a result of what happened in Abu Dhabi. So. Yeah, I mean, I think it's all to play for with Toto probably in wanting to invest more in George because he's the future. There's just absolutely no doubt about that. And a first win for him would be great whenever it comes. A win for Lewis this year is great whenever it comes. But realistically, he's not winning the championship this year. So does it really matter? His trophy cabinet, he must have a massive storage locker with a lot of trophies in it at this point.
He does. I'm sure he does. And I'm sure he's kept every single one of them.
What's your prediction for the podium?
This weekend, I'm going George, Max, and Carlos.
I mean, pick any other driver. There's another 18. Okay, good. All right, great. Fantastic.
And
Carlos,
also we can the one prediction we can be sure of is that even under the Singapore sweat, Carlos is going to take his helmet off and he's going to look like an absolute god.
Yeah, he's always going to look good. Although K-Mag's hair is always a strong second, so we'll see how much product he uses to make sure it stays exactly like that when he takes the helmet off at the end of it. But I think it's going to be an interesting race. It'll be interesting to see whether or not this is a DRS train track, or if we do see significant ability to follow and overtake, because of course this is the first time we've been here, as you said, for a long time. New car regulations, all that sort of other stuff. So it might go from being traditionally a great track to being now a boring track with DRS trains. We just don't know, but it's exciting nonetheless that we get to go back to Singapore and be envious of everyone who's there drinking, and including you fans, listeners, whatever you're doing. I know there's a couple of Lakeside Drive people who are there this weekend, so just have an incredible time whatever you're doing.
Absolutely. I reckon someone's just look, we can all just hope for a slingshot safety car that's going to keep things interesting no matter what. And there'll be some people who complain about good luck. There'll be some people who complain about bad luck, and all of a sudden their opinions will change as to whether or not you're allowed to change your tyres under a safety car when it doesn't work for them. But we'll see what happens. Like you said, new track as far as these cars are concerned. So we'll see what happens. But that's it for this gradually fizzling out free practice Fridays with Freya. Thanks for joining me, James.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.